Okay, so good afternoon, honorable guests, teachers, students, and also our Zoom audiences. Today is our great honor to invite Professor Frédéric Martel from the Zurich University of the Arts in Switzerland. So Frédéric is actually a very famous New York Times best-selling writer, and he is a journalist as well as a researcher. So he is actually very well known for being a very prominent figure in cultural critique. And also today he will be bringing us more insight in the roles of arts and culture, especially seeing how it changes in the double transition of the digital and ecological changes in our current daily life. And students here today are mostly from the cultural and creative industries of our Department of Art and Design. And today's class is basically on the culture and technology conducted by Mr. Samuel Swope. And so we are very looking forward to what Frédéric is going to share with us. And if you're ready, I will pass on the time to you in the next hour. Okay, thank you.
Bonjour. Je viens du sud de la France. I come from south of France. And en français, j'ai un accent très fort. In French, I have a very strong accent. So you might not understand my French. So I'm going to speak in English, okay? First of all, I would like to say that when you have a general lecture like that, of course, it's difficult to put footnotes, okay, and not even references. So the main lecture the main ideas I will develop today are based on a more general text that I wrote, and you can find on this website, which is the Zurich Center for Creative Economy, and the title of the lecture of today is Geolocalization, and basically, you can find all the references in this lecture for free. Just to go on the website, which is creativeeconomies.com, and you will have all the, dozens and even hundreds of references of things that I'm going to say maybe in a very quick way sometimes. So I would like to begin by telling you that I am always, and I think all of you are also in the same position, especially in Hong Kong, to try to understand where I live, where I am from, what is my place. And for example, you mentioned the fact that I teach in Zurich, in the Zurich University of the Arts, but I'm French. I'm also from south of France. So it's already three kind of identities in some way. At the same time, I can be a man or a woman, gay or lesbian. I can be an intellectual or maybe an artist or maybe a working class person. All that are different identities, that part of me. I will go back on that later, but I think these multiple identities are extremely important in general, and especially today with the digital time. And all my research, my books, also my interviews I can make everywhere when I travel are always trying to answer this question. For example, in the south of France, I grew up in a very little village, in a farm, very poor area, very poor farm. In a very strange way, farmers in south of France, probably in the 1950s, 60s, when my parents were young adults, they were listening jazz music. You know, jazz music, which is quote unquote black music from the US. And we were in a farm in the south of France. Why? These people were listening jazz music. That's a kind of a mystery. So to answer a bit and to understand the mystery of this question, I decided to live in the US, where I lived 4 years. I did my PhD there. master, I don't know how you say that in English, that was directing my PhD was a Harvard professor. I live at Harvard on the campus for basically 4 years. And I tried to understand why the US were enough efficient to speak to a little farmer like my parents in this little village in south of France. Then I tried to understand how this culture, either American, but also French and Hong Kongese and so on and so forth, was able to travel worldwide very quickly, especially today in the time of cultural industries, stronger digitalization, of course, and the relation that we are part of a global culture world. So I'm going to try to discuss that today, cultural, and I will say we can call it cultural globalization. I'm among the people who think globalization is not just economic transfer of product. It's not just identity, which is also the case, but it's also culture. And my main focus in the last 20 years was mainly on globalization of culture, cultural globalization. And in a very basic way, I will begin by summarize 3 big transition that we are already basically in. The first one is a big change of the definition of culture, a transformation of actually cultural policy as well. The second one is the transformation of the cultural industry themselves. So the policy and then the industry, which are different worlds. And then, of course, a digital transition that you know even probably more than me, because in Hong Kong, people are very online. I mean, we also are, but you are even more, even in this class, you know, everybody is online. So let me go back a little bit in the 3 mutation transition that I was mentioning to give you a few points about these 3 large mutation. The first one is the transformation of the arts and cultural policy. For a very long time, cultural policy, art policy was based on just trying to provide the arts to a larger audience. And by the way, that's exactly the same goal, the same role, the same, I would say, direction in France and in the US. Quite often, especially French people, believe that we are different. You know, we will be a little country, but we have the arts. You know, we have a Ministry of Culture, and in front, the US will be just entertainment, and basically without a Minister of Culture, but they have Hollywood and Broadway. That's basically a fake idea. That's not at all like that, because in fact, and I can go back in the details if you want in the conversation later, we in France spend public money for the arts exactly in the kind of same percentage per capita toward the arts than you have in the US. It's done in a very different way. In France, it's public subsidy by the Ministry of Culture, basically, and also local administration, and you give money away to the arts. In the US, as you know, it's mainly tax deduction. It's mainly community-based. It's also done by some local agency, the National Endowment for the Arts, some local state agency, city agencies, and many other foundations, and as I said, community-based organization, also philanthropy. But at the end, it's kind of the same amount of money per capita. That was my PhD. My PhD was based on that, to look at the percentage of money you give away. And in the US, it's not giveaway, it's just a tax deduction, which at the end still is the state, the government that pays the money for the art. But instead of paying, they just give you a credit in terms of taxes. But for the cost of the government is the same. The difference is that in one side, the government try to decide what kind of art you produce, whether in the US, it's basically yourself, you decide where you give your money, and the government just give you back some taxes deduction. But the goal is the same. The goal is always make the art more available to everybody, having more diversity, and trying to educate people to a better something, better life, better culture, better knowledge, and so on and so forth. And the goal is the same, but also the results are the same, which was for me another discovery. Basically, I don't go in the details, and it can be a bit different from a year to another one, but basically you have the same number of people that go to theater or to museum or to a jazz concert or to see a movie or to read a book in the US and in France, basically. There is a few differences, a little more people reading books in France, a little more people going to theater and jazz in the US, but actually the numbers are pretty much the same, which means two very different systems. A very French typical subsidized top-down system has the same goal, the same money involved, and the same results than the very different American US system that is mainly based on philanthropy for the arts. And I don't know the Hong Kongese system, that's why I don't discuss it, but I think it's a kind of a in-between. You have some money from philanthropists, you have big institutions that are also helped by the government sometimes. I visited some of them, and it's an interesting place. So these cultural policy are in a way the same, a bit everywhere. I could take also the English model or the German model that I know pretty well, and they are kind of different, but with the same goals. And at the same time, we can also say that all this system failed. They failed because at the end, when you look at the number, even though they are the same in the US and France, the numbers are not very good. It's about, I don't know, 16% of the people going to museum every year. It's not enough. The same with music and theater and so on and so forth. So I do think we still need to have a better cultural policy because it's not enough efficient. Another reason of the difficulty of this cultural policy is that in the US as well as in Europe, it takes the arts as a very, with an capital A, the arts. And everything that will be not art is considered as, not really culture. The French are very good on that. You believe that art is really art, and the other things, video games, mangas, animations, and so on, it's not really considered as culture. Of course, it's not true. And we know today that some of the more innovative form of arts, some extremely interesting and complicated, complex art form are within the manga and the cartoons and the animation films and so on and so forth. So by definition, you had to enlarge the way you believe in the arts. And the definition itself has to be enlarged. And that's one of the mutation we had already, even in a country that is very European-centered, top-down, and considering the arts with this capital A, the definition of culture changed in the US, also in France. In France, the Ministry of Culture today funds some animation. They fund some, not exactly manga, because we are not a big producer of manga, as you know, but they do it for arts that were not supposed to be art before. Internet art, as I said, cartoons, and so on and so forth. Another big element that changed the definition of the arts and cultural policy, art policy, it's diversity. Before, it was very simple and very basic to see, All the artists were men, basically, white, quite often pretty old. And it was a system where we never questioned that. We never said, why there is no woman in the art world? Why we have no people that are not white, and so on and so forth. Today, that debate is totally different. If you go back to when the changes occurred, I would say in the US, it's basically between the immigration law by Johnson in 1965, 64, 65, and the Supreme Court decision in 1978, I think, or 77, 78, called Bakke, B-A-K-K-E, the Bakke decision, that create, in fact, the priority in terms of diversity. You know, before that, the US was really a melting pot. The idea is you can come from Hong Kong or you can be from Mexico. You arrive in the US and you lose your identity. You lose your language, kind of, even though you never lose a language. But the idea was you become American, meaning you leave away all your identity form, your language, your culture, what made you the person you were. Today, that's not the approach. Nobody will believe America is a melting pot where everybody is going to become the same. On the contrary, since the diversity decision by the Supreme Court, the Bakke decision of 1978, diversity became the matrix of the country, not anymore the melting pot. And the matrix means you are American, but you can be also Mexican, you can speak Spanish, and actually Spanish language and Portuguese are languages, official language in many states. For example, even in Florida, you go to Florida, there is 3 main languages, official languages, English, Spanish, Portuguese, and also in Texas and so on. And in addition, all the elements of culture are also see in a positive way. You don't have to cut that. You don't have to abandon that. On the contrary, you stay what you were before, and that's the way you are American. And I would say this definition, and I'm not American. There is some here, but I'm not promoting or being against America. I just try to see what's happening. It's a kind of the matrix of the world. Even in France, a country that for many years was kind of very afraid by diversity for many reasons, today believe we are a country of people from different origin with basically you speak French, but you can also speak some other language, and you have a parent and grandparents from other territory. And this kind of diversity matrix is part of your of the matrix of the country. I can add some other element linked to the role of the non-profit sector in the art world, the world of university. Actually, we are in a university today. And as you may know, university plays somewhere a very important role in the arts. In some other country, not at all. I don't know exactly how it works in Hong Kong, but for example, in France, the arts, they don't exist basically in universities. We don't have theater, museums. We don't have cultural practice in universities. And if you want to become a musician, you go to, in fact, you go to a special school. At the same time, in the US, everywhere you have a much more influence of the arts. You have museums, you have presenters, big theater that present the arts. If you go, for example, in New Hampshire, Dartmouth College. Dartmouth College is both a university and one of the key places for the arts in New Hampshire. The same with the Tisch School in New York, or of course in New York you don't see that much, because in New York there is so many arts institutions that the Tisch School at New York University is a bit in the middle of a big place of the arts. But if you go in again in Arkansas, for example, in Iowa, in states that are not as cultural as New York City or Boston or Chicago or this kind of city, you will see how the campus, the university, is the place for the arts. And by the way, that's another story. I'm not going to go on these details, but if you want to understand Hollywood, if you want to understand Broadway, if you even want to understand the internet, you need to see the roots of these things within the universities. Today, you cannot understand the experimentation, the risk, the new ideas in the film industry if you don't see the link between Disney and CalArts, between the Hollywood system and USC. USC is extremely important, University of Southern California, or also with the UCLA or with the T School in New York. The same with Broadway. A lot of the Broadway plays are in fact created on campuses, and we call that the tryout. You try a play on campus, and when it works, when the students are happy, then you transfer to Broadway. I can take many other examples. University presses are very important in the US to create a new writer. It doesn't count that much in terms of money. It's about 10% of the number of titles overall in the US, and probably 3% of the overall money made by publisher. But in terms of diversity, it's important. So universities are quite often in the US the places where you create things, you innovate, you take risk, you do research and development, all these things that help the creative system to work. Oh, what I'm saying here, you can say, why is telling us that? I know what I'm saying. When you want to understand soft power and the power of the US, you need to understand all that elements. And I don't want to do politics here, but I have been in Beijing several times. All my books are translated in mainland, in Mandarin, in Chinese. And I spoke and I was invited to explain how it works, the soft power and the American cultural system. And I don't think they got it. They believe the US, it's always propaganda. They just are interested in money. And by the way, that's true. They are interested in money and they are doing propaganda. But that's not the only things. You cannot understand the US if you don't see the roots in universities, the roots with the non-profit sector, the fact that it's totally disconnected to the market. And that explains the power of creativity, innovation, diversity, the freedom of artists, the freedom of the place of the artist, women in the arts, LGBT people in the arts. All that explain actually the soft power of the US. And if you want just succeeding with the money without taking care of all these elements, the other element, that's basically a failure. And that's, for example, the failure of many countries in Europe that try to put money, billions, to create a music industry and book industry and movie industry in their country, but it never worked because they don't have all this experimentation, innovation, taking risks, freedom of artists, and the ability to let them do whatever they want. So to finish with this first element on art and cultural policy, I will say enlargement of the definition. By the way, there is a famous sentence by the director Jean-Luc Godard who said, "Culture is the rule, art is the exception." That's a good expression. It means a bit everything is culture. Culture is the rule, but art is kind of rare and the exception. That's kind of the old way of thinking, but it's important also to see this difference when it happens. Second element, and that's still a debate about the power, the soft power, and the importance of cultural industry, the big changes in the cultural industry in the last 20, 25 years. And that's also something I try to explain in Beijing, but also in Japan or in India when I was invited. It's why this sector has changed and why it's so powerful now. If you look at numbers globally in the world stage, you will see that in the last 20 years, I don't remember the exact number, but they are in my in the document I mentioned, you had a market worldwide for goods and services that are in the cultural industry and creative industry that basically doubled. So we have much more exchanges in culture than before, and they are much more expensive and also much more important in the economies. And by the way, there is many economies, and probably Hong Kong is one of them, that can benefit from that. Culture is a key element of employment, a key element for soft power, but also for the economics of a country now, and it can increase. And you have some country like, for example, Switzerland, where I teach. Switzerland was extremely, rich because of the bank system, as you know, and quite often was not totally well regulated, to say that in a soft way. Now it's regulated. So the bank kind of tax evasion and these kind of things are probably less important and less possible than before. So the bank system is going to be flat in terms of banking money, banking revenues. That's why culture can be an alternative for Switzerland to be more powerful in the global stage. At the same time, creative industry and cultural industries have changed in a very deep way in the last decades. I use mainly data from the WTO, IMF, the World Bank, and also ILO. ILO is the International Labour Organization. And when you look at the data, you will see the change, and you will see also why it's a totally different world than before. Again, excuse me, I go very quickly and I summarize things that are complicated, but just trust me, I have 4 books of more than 500 pages on this different subject. And again, you will have in this article that actually doesn't appear. It appears here, but not here. Something wrong. Because I changed it, but it's not here. Really? You see, it's not the same. Huh? Something. So I was mentioning something you cannot see. Sorry for that. It's going to come. So sorry. So basically, the changes are very important. So I summarize it quickly. I would say 25 years ago, let's say before the internet, so before 2000. Internet was before, but the big change is around 2000. You had goods, cultural goods. Goods mean books, DVD, CDs. You had to burn them, to fabric them in terms of in a factory, and then they travel, and then you have to go from through the border. You have to pay for that, and so on and so forth. So it was a traditional industry. In a way, the way you also built the place, the creative industries, was a factory. That's the old Hollywood system. What is the Hollywood system? It's very simple. You have a big factory. Everybody is working in the factory. Everybody is on payroll. You have the idea in the beginning. Actors and directors, everybody was working, in the factory. At the end, you have the goods that exit. That's the traditional Hollywood model. Today, it doesn't work like that. First of all, you don't have the factory. Second of all, you don't have goods. Third of all, you have nobody basically on payroll. So that's not at all the system. The system was based on goods. Today, it's based on services. Before, it was a studio, and now you have mainly independence. Why independence? The studio, basically, Disney, Paramount, Universal, are big banks. They have the capital, they have the money. They keep the copyright. And then If it doesn't work, it's okay. We will survive. Don't worry. Here it is. So you see, it's different. Thank you. So you went from a cultural industry that was a factory the old way, and today you have the banks that just decide to fund a studio that is very little, quite often independent, specialized, and this little I would say corporation will itself find people, work with talents to create a movie, for example. What I'm telling here, it seems like a bit strange, but it is the way all the cultural industry work today. In the video games, in the book industry, in the music industry. In the music industry, the big Universal and so on are banks. You have the labels that are important. In the book industry, imprints are the place where the things is working. And in the film industry, you have this kind of specialized unit, independent studio that are the place where everything is done. So when you have big country, I saw that in Egypt, for example, sometimes in China, but also quite often the case in many countries that try to replicate the American model, but they are still thinking of it like it was in the 1930s with this kind of industry system. They are not about how it works today. Today, it works with the little guy, the independent, this specialized unit that is the place of the talent. And then you have corporation, you have talent agency, you have agents, you have lawyer, and so on, that make the deal to have all these people working together on a project base, one project, and not on payroll. And then why you have this system? It's because it's the way they step by step created the system to be able to have the freedom of expression for the artist. The way the artist can be free to do whatever he wants. Because a movie, it's first of all a director, a writer, an actor. It's not the bank, it's not the studio that decide. And if you not cultivate the talent it goes somewhere else. And with one talent, you can have an industry. Without one talent, sometimes you're dead. Look at Spielberg. Look at people that were so important then they create Lucas. Take, you take 5 guys, you don't have them. The history of Hollywood in the last 20 years is different. The other big element, and that's also an important point to understand, is that the one who owns that big studio doesn't have a role on the content. If you believe you are going to buy a studio and you are going to decide, it doesn't work that way. Let me take an example. I was in Tokyo, in Japan, with the big president, the CEO, actually the board president of Sony. And it was a few years ago. One Spider-Man was out. And I asked the guy, why did you decide to do that Spider-Man? I don't remember which one it was, but I think the cost was 500 million just for launching the movie. And the CEO, the president of the board, said to me, I cannot answer because we never greenlight the project. The guy, he owns the studio, but he doesn't decide. He didn't decide. Why is that? It's because still he is the bank. And the decision has been made by the little guy somewhere in the US, not by him. So you can buy the studio if you want money. Why not? But if you want to decide the content, it's not going to work that way. And that's a big difference with what, for example, the Frankfurt School believed in the 1950s. You know, the Marxist school was thinking the one that owns the means of production would decide the culture and the product. That's not the case anymore. Nobody is really in charge of deciding. You can give a green light, but the green light is mainly based on many things, not on content, or very rarely. That's why you don't understand the American soft power and influence if you believe that, I don't know, Joe Biden or Donald Trump or whoever is deciding for the movie. That's not true. It's not even the CEO of the corporation. It's not even the Disney CEO. It's really decided at a very level, quite often in this kind of specialized unit that make the movie that will be successful or not. And by the way, there is hundreds of little specialized units like that. There is not just one or two. So it's extremely decentralized and extremely specialized. I will add another last point on that. It's the role of, I would say, the elements I was mentioning before, how the content, diversity, and many other elements play a key role to help the movie, for example, but also the book or the video games to be more successful. If you go back to the example of the US, you will see that one of the reasons, and again, I'm still thinking of that as the little son of a farmer from south of France to try to understand why this movie made in the US or music, jazz music, or books that were US based can be successful in a little village in south of France. Quite often, as French, we believe American culture is very imperialistic. It is always fighting against us, or it is trying to give us some values, you know. And we see American culture as a propaganda quite often as French. But when you look at the reality, when you are in Iran and you see a movie from the US, when you are in Cuba and you see a movie from the US, when you are in Lebanon or in Jordan and you see a movie with women, with Black people, with LGBT people, you don't think it's propaganda. You think it speaks to you. You think it is part of a movie that gives you some freedom. And I think you have here another explanation of the success of American cultural industries, the way they can, and I do think there is some propaganda again. I do think there is also, of course, they want the money. I'm not, we cannot be naive on that. But it's not as simple. You also have a way they speak to you and give you some freedom through that kind of content. And if you don't know that, you don't understand the power of the US culture. Let me go now on the third transition, the digital transition. That's a very banal one, you know that probably better than me, but I would like to begin by the general feeling we have about the internet. And that's also the idea quite often people in the Silicon Valley are telling. When you speak to them, and I lived in the US, I spoke to many people at Facebook, at Google, and so on in the Silicon Valley, and they tell you, sometimes not directly like that, but they tell you, you know, we live in a world where there is no border. There is kind of the content will move from everywhere, will go everywhere. You know, everybody is speaking basically the same language. Of course, they mean English, even though it's quite often globish. And they believe we are going to share, or everybody else is going to share the same content, again in the same language, and the world is flat, to summarize. And by the way, it was the title of a book by Tom Friedman, I guess, in the US. I profoundly believe that's not the case, that the world is not flat, that the world is not seeing the same content, speaking the same language, and even not sharing the same internet. I do believe that we are more in the process of fragmentation. And to try to explain what I'm saying here, I would like to use two different words that exist in English. And actually in French, you might not speak French, it's only the same word. So it's difficult for a French to understand the difference because we have only one word. But what is good sometimes with English is that they have two words for the same meaning in French. That's because, as you know, English, especially in the US, but also in UK, but also in the US, is really based on Latin words that quite often come from French, but also German words that come from different origin. And so for that very reason, they have two words for many, many things. So that's the word frontière. And as you know, we can say borders and we can say frontières. And they are not exactly the same. And that's, for me, what's happening on the internet. It means there is no borders on the internet. I take out the debate about China, but we still have frontiers. How does this work? A border is a border. You need a visa, you need a passport, there is the flag, there is the police control. That's a place that is controlled. I would say, except in a few countries, internet is free. There is no borders on the internet. That's absolutely sure. And I can be in India, I can be in Japan, I can be in Brazil and have the same access to the same content. Everybody will have this page if they put this correct URL on their internet. However, borders doesn't mean frontier. Frontier is something more symbolic. It's not a place where you need a passport. It's free in theory, but frontier, as you know, it's like the new frontier, for example, of Kennedy going to the moon. It's the frontier when you went west in the US or in Brazil, also the new frontier, it's going to Amazonia or to going in California for the US. It's a symbolic frontier and a frontier that can change because you move. What is the frontier on the internet? It's mainly, first of all, even before the language, the place where you live. You are territorialized. You live somewhere. And I go back to what I'm beginning with. Where do we live? On the internet, you live in a place. You're not, even though you are in the metaverse or you are on Facebook or wherever you want to be, you are somewhere. It means that, for example, if I want to eat Japanese tonight, I mean, I'm not going to look at a Japanese restaurant, even though they are probably very good in Tokyo, because tonight I'm not going to be in Tokyo. The only place where I need a Japanese restaurant will be in Hong Kong tonight. So because of that, the territory, the place where you live is the key element of the place on the internet. Then you have, of course, the language. You know, for example, my kid can maybe speak to anyone in Korea or into India or to Brazil. It's easy because they can make it through Facebook or Twitter or whatever they want, but they cannot because they don't speak the language. And even if they will speak the language, in reality, they don't have to say anything to this guy because they don't live in the same territory. And so they don't have a friend in India or in Japan. In general, they have their friends in their city, quite often in their university, and sometimes even in the high school where they are. So territory, language, and also the sphere of culture, the kind of culture you're part of, all that explain and makes, in fact, frontiers. And these frontiers still exist. It means there is an internet in Hong Kong that is not the same as the one we have in France, even though actually, of course, we can go to the same pages. And that's, I think, extremely important to see and to understand that the flattonization, you say that in English, flattonization, the fact that the world is more flat, it's not exactly what's happening. It's not the case. I would like now to to finish with three little points. To go back to some example about the mainstream and unification of the world, and to make some arguments against that. To discuss very quickly the question of sustainability and the arts, which is another big mutation, and to conclude on the word I use, geolocalization. First of all, I would like to take a different point of view that a lot of people are taking about the uniformization, the mainstreamization of the world in culture, and take, for example, the example of music. We do believe, and a lot of people criticizing the West, criticizing the Western world, is saying, you know, you make the world globalized in terms of culture. Everybody is listening the same music. Everybody is basically sharing the same artist. And again, for one part, it's true. I'm absolutely convinced that we have, you and me, many artists and in music in common. I'm not going to give some name because you will make fun of me because I'm not from your generation. But I'm sure that in hip hop, in rap, in some electro music, we might have the same name. And that's actually what's happening in Europe. We are 27 countries, and when you ask some kids like you are, what are the music you listen? All of them will share some musicians that are common. These musicians will be quite often American, at least in Europe. The large majority of the music that is the same music shared by all the kids right now in the 27 European countries is basically American music. You might have some exception. One K-pop artist, very rarely. K-pop is interesting, we know it a bit, but that's not very mainstream in a large way in Europe. You might have some one Latino artist, maybe Shakira or whatever, but Shakira is totally Americanized. So it is true that the music, at least in Europe, is kind of the same for some generation. And again, you explained the jazz music I was saying for 50, 60 years ago. And I can say the same when I was young, everybody was listening the same. Again, I'm not going to give you the name because you will see I'm totally a square, but we had some names that were common, I think, to all the kids when I was young, 10 years ago. But when you look at in reality and you ask again to the 27 different kids from 27 European countries, they will also mention other names that are not American. And all these names will be national quite often. You go to Spain, there is tons of artists that are extremely famous in Spain. The problem is that in France, we don't know them. In Italy, we don't know, they don't know them. If you go to Germany, you will have a lot of Germany music. That is extremely important. But again, in France, we don't listen them. And in Spain, they don't listen them either. And that's probably the same in Hong Kong, even though Hong Kong is a more interesting place because it's a mix of Hong Kongese culture, mainland China culture, but also Cantonese culture, and also Japanese culture by some other ways, and K-pop and so on. But still, I'm sure there is a very strong local Hong Kongese music and Cantonese music. If you take Brazil, for example, I look at the data from Spotify. All I was saying now is based on the data of Spotify. Spotify, it's the same. You look at the global best musician, you have 20, and the 20 will be, 19 of them will be American. But then if you go to Brazil and you look at specifically what are the people listening in Brazil, you will still have that kind of, I would say 1/3 will be this kind of big star from the US, but another third, another part will be Latin music, what we call now Latin music, which is pan-Latino music, quite often in Spanish, but sometimes also in Portuguese. And then 1/3 will be Brazilian music. And Brazilian music is extremely strong in Brazil. So what I want to make as a point here is that even though again the music can be totally I mean the same everywhere, that's true. There is a mainstream American and sometimes Japanese, sometimes a bit of K-pop, and sometimes of, why not, some Mandarin pop, and that can be popular worldwide. But you have mainly a big third of the music that is global, a big third that is a bit more regional in the Arab world, for example, and then a big third that is local. And that's the reality of globalization, not just mainstream, flat, everywhere listening the same product, but a much more diverse, non-uniformized music scene. One word now on the arts and sustainability, because I would say that's the new big change we have in the field of arts. Basically, how the environmental issue has some effects on the arts in a large way, arts and culture, to take the difference of Jean-Luc Godard. I don't want to go to the details because I'm basically at the end of the time I wanted to have, but I would say the arts are affected, are concerned with environmental issue in, let's say, 5 or 6 different ways. The first one, and it's very easy to understand, is what I will say just sustainable culture and eco-responsibility. It means you're an artist, especially in visual arts, for example, on theater, you try not to use too much materials to just protect a bit the planet. So in theater, you don't change the sets all the time and you destroy the sets to create a new one. You try to reuse it. In museums, you know, you have some little wall you built when you have a new exhibition, and in general you destroy all that and you throw that away. Now they try to avoid that. That's the first way environmental issue affect the arts. The second way, it's by the subject-wise. Will be, for example, the environmental issue will be part of the subject, a movie or a book that will discuss environmental issue as its main subject. The third way is outreach, meaning the artist will use his art to promote the environmental issue. And that's the case more and more, especially in visual arts. The fourth one will be, and that's very interesting, how the environmental issue can change the medium itself, how you have a change of the medium. Typically, for example, let's say arte povera, which is not new, it's pretty old actually, but arte povera was a way to use a very basic product that were very cheap. And I can mention another name, an artist from New York. I think he's from New York, actually. He's American for sure. David, his name is David Ammons, and he's a very great artist. He does arts only based on things he finds in the street. So it's a kind of the medium changed by the fact that he used some material in a new way. The fifth change of the arts because of the environmental issue will be a relocalization and a re-discussion between local, global, and national. And to finish, and that's probably the more interesting one, the sixth change about the arts with the environmental issue is the new aesthetism, do you say that in English? Aesthetism that is created with the environmental issue. For that, I will mention the Taipei Biennale that was 2 years ago, where some Bruno Latour, actually a French philosopher who died unfortunately recently, tried to see how new form of art will, not just the form itself, but the aesthetism will be affected by the arts. And on that, I suggest you, if you're interested in this subject, Bruno Latour wrote several interesting books on that. One of them is Où atterrir, I think the translation in English is Down to Earth. It's a very good book, and I recommend that for those who are interested in arts and environmental issues. So to finish, as a conclusion now, I will say, as I show in the discussion, there is still some frontiers in the art scene. There is still some changes that are extremely important in terms of new way of thinking the arts, new cultural industry transformation, and the digital transition. That's why I do believe that in this question of culture, we are neither local nor global. And that's why, and by the way, we never saw anyone that will be a global human being. Everybody is a human being per se, not globally. And that's why I use this title, geolocalization, because it means that at the end we are geolocalized. And I don't say that in a kind of police way. I just say we are geolocalized because we are somewhere in the world. And I use also the word geo because, as you know, geo meaning the planet. And so it's also a way to use the transformation of the arts and culture that is both changed by the digitalization, by globalization, but also by the question of the planet that will change probably the general pictures of the arts in the coming years and decades. Thanks.
So thank you very much for Frédéric's wonderful sharing, and also summarizes many different important essence on how we understand the concept of geolocalization in terms of the cultural industries. So now we will open our floor for question and answer. And if you have any question, and also for the online audience, you may type in the chat box. And for the on-site audience, if you have any question, please raise your hand and also introduce your name and your program year.
Don't be shy.
So perhaps I will start with the first question then.
That's a good, you're a good organizer. You always have a question in case.
Yes, I have actually prepared a list of questions, so be prepared. The first question that I would like to ask is that since we in Hong Kong, we just removed the mask restriction, and that would mark the post-COVID-19 period. And the COVID-19 pandemic actually imposes a lot of challenges to artists and also cultural producers. In the way that they use and turn into online cultural production, but at the same time, a lot of the audience, they actually expect the content to be free because like online and browsing the web, meaning is basically free of charge, at least to Hong Kong people a lot of the times. So how do you see the future global trend in terms of this kind of online cultural production and consumption? And if we understand it by the concept of geolocalization and also soft power, how do you think the world is changing after the pandemic?
The first question with the pandemic is how it affects the way we go to theater, to movies, to exhibitions and so on. And the changes, are they just linked to that period and things will be back to normal after a while? Or because of that and because of the youth using new, changes in the way they consume culture, the changes will be longer. we will see, because it's difficult to give you an answer. And especially whenever I discuss some topics like I did, I'm based on a lot of qualitative research, interviews worldwide, and a lot of data that are based on quantitative data, which we don't have for now for the post-COVID world. So I cannot really, in a scientific way, answer the question. But I would say more as an intuitive way, much more basic. We see already in France, for example. I use France because restriction has been stopped many months ago. So we have a bit of more time to analyze. The way people went back to museums is incredible. People wanted to go back to museums in numbers that quite often we never seen before. That's not true, of course, in Le Louvre or Versailles or the big places, because the Chinese tourists and even American are not back. So you don't see the numbers so big. But whenever you go to museums that were mainly made with local audiences, they are amazing. The people are back, really. In the same way, I do believe for movie theater, the problem is not the fact that the youth and people don't want to go back to movies. I think it's mainly that for a while, because the movie theater were still closed in some countries, Hollywood didn't produces, but didn't release some important blockbuster, and because of that the attendance was low. But whenever there is a movie interesting, people are back. And so I know I really believe, I might be wrong, and I'm also from another generation than you and some people here, but I do believe, I mean, it's great to see a series TV on Netflix. I love that. It's great to share things with your family on TV, but the movie industry is an experience that you also need. You need to go out, because you go out with your friends, you go out with your date, you go out to meet people, and that's not something internet will give you. I know some people are totally inside their bubble, the otaku in Japan and so on, but I don't think it will be that main movement. What was the other part of the question?
I actually forgot, but never mind. I have the second question. So nowadays, a lot of the artists actually turn into like digital production, like using AI, artificial intelligence, Midjourney, those kind of apps. So the human creativity involved, together with some of the computational processing, turn out to have new forms of artwork. So how do you think this kind of phenomenon will be relating to a country's cultural policy in the future? So would there be any new policy in the Europe or US in terms of regulating this kind of practice, and in terms of the copyrights, intellectual property rights? So what are the trends that you will be seeing?
Thanks. And by the way, I found the second part of the question because it was about copyright, just especially when you said the youth are not used to, because they are on the internet, they're not used to pay. Let me be very clear. I was a big supporter of people, some of my friends, that download illegally music in the beginning of the years 2000. And sometimes they were jailed, not really jailed in France, but fined because of that. And I was helping them, and we had lawyers to support them. Why? Because at that time, you ask the kids to pay for music, but the music was not available online. And you don't buy a CD when you are online. So I thought it was not fair to ask them, to punish them for that. Today, it's a totally different pictures. If you want, you can have all music available in the world, everything, for €9 a month. I mean, you can say, I don't want to pay. You can say on the internet it has to be free. But in this case, you cannot tell you like music. You cannot tell you like the artist. I mean, paying €10 a month or $10 a month for having all the music, When I was young, I was buying at least 3 or 4 CDs every month, which is 4 times that price. So if you love music, you just, and I think we need to do some campaign to explain to the youth that music has a cost. If you want to have great artists, if you want to have writers like I am, if you want to have movies, you need to pay in some way. Otherwise, you will have either subsidized culture by a government that, and quite often it's political, or you will have bad culture. Like you have in Nigeria, you don't pay for the movie, but the movie are made with less than 200 euro each. So of course the quality cannot be. So that's why again, I understand if it's not available, if you cannot access it. For example, if somebody doesn't pay the $10 to Spotify in Cuba, I understand, because $10 in Cuba, it's half a month of a salary. So I do respect their choice. But, you know, in Hong Kong, in France, in countries, in the US, where you have a bit of money, you need to pay for your music. And that's, I'm very proud to buy my music. And I also buy books. You know, I can ask a lot of books because I'm a writer, but I buy one book every day. Every day of my life, I buy a new book. Every day, even here. That's cost me also a lot in the luggage when I have to come back. Why? It's not just because I think it's important to buy books, because I want to help writers when they write and spend time for the books. Now, going back to the second question, or the third, you know, I'm a big supporter of the changes in culture because of the digitalization. I think it's great. I think it's important, innovative, it's experimental, it's innovative. We'll see. A lot of bullshit will exist, of course, but a lot of things will be important. Changes will be great. And I'm always looking on innovation in a good way. Not trying to say, oh, we need to protect. That's a bit what I don't like in France and what I like in China or in Hong Kong. It's, you know, you find a CEO of a studio in the movie industry or in the video game industry. In France, it will be a guy of 80 years old that will say, I want to protect my culture. You are here in Hong Kong, the guy that runs the studio is 25 years old or 30 years old, and he said, I just want to expand, I want to experiment, I want to try new things. That's, I think, why we love Asia. It's like, you know, you look at opportunities, you look at the future, you want to speak to new people, new country, new generations, and not just protecting the past.
Okay, so that's all my questions. I'm now asking for your questions, the students or our guests or our teachers. Any questions from you? Okay, by the end, Jonathan.
Jonathan is also, he was charged to prepare, maybe.
As AI tools are appeared in the market, will you think these AI tools will replace the role of those content creators, and how to prevent this situation happen?
I think it's about AI, artificial intelligence. Do you think it would be replacing human creativity in the future?
You know, I'm always a bit afraid of the double side attitude that say, you know, everything will be changed because of artificial intelligence, or artificial intelligence will be stupid and they are not going to create anything. I think, of course, it's going to be in the middle of that. It's absolutely, it's probably true that big things will happen. We'll see, but we already see a lot of things. At the same time, and maybe I'm saying that because I'm myself a writer, and you know, when you write a book, I mean, I'm sharing my own experience because that's the only one I know. But when you write a book, it's not just, of course, you read tons of documents and you meet tons of people and I do that, and these kind of things, a computer can do that. But whenever I meet somebody, it's not just thousands of information. There is suddenly something that is different, that will connect to another thing different. Then there is my style, good or bad, whatever, but I have a style. And actually, on that, I'm in the Godard side, Jean-Luc Godard, the director side. The art is, first of all, the form. It's not just the content. The content is important, and I'm a content guy. But the way you put the content is creating a form. I'm not so sure, but I might be wrong, that artificial intelligence can also create the form, invent something that hasn't been invented before. You know, it's you're not going to be, I don't want to use, Michelangelo or Leonardo da Vinci, but when they create something, nobody have done that before. Nobody were able to imagine that. And that, in a way, in a little way, every writer creates something that never happened before. That's why art is important. It's not replication. It's not, even you do a blockbuster. Let's see a blockbuster. A lot of people in kind of the Marxist way, or in France, because we are very we learn a lot by the Marxism theory on the arts, again, the Frankfurt School and so on. We will say, oh, they're all the same. And I even met a director, very famous. I won't give you when I was writing my book Mainstream, she said, you know, the Americans, they do blockbuster, but if you give me the millions they have, I will do a blockbuster. In fact, it's not true. She won't be able to do it, because even the blockbuster, even the Spider-Man 1, 2, 3, 4 are prototype. All of them are different. And so when Star Wars was created, or Spielberg, a new movie, or it is something new. I'm not so sure artificial intelligence, based on tons and tons and tons of data, can invent something totally new. But again, I might be wrong. I know we can also learn, teach the artificial intelligence to learn how to create new things. That's actually the new way of thinking AI. Because in French it's the opposite. We say we always want to have a different way than the American speaking. On the end, l'intelligence artificielle, so EA and it's AI, whatever. But even if they create things, it creates things. We'll see, and why not? I would be happy to see. And we also change. My culture will be probably very different than yours, because we don't have the same age, because we are not from the same country, because you're much more in artificial intelligence and manga and cartoons and K-pop than I am. We'll see.
So, any more questions? Okay, Vicky, our colleague.
Thank you for your sharing. I'm indeed still composing the question in my mind, but I think one of the points about the geolocalization also come from algorithm, because I think now we are in Hong Kong in the post national security law era, that actually I start using like VPN, and then sometimes I would play around with it. Like sometimes I would set myself as in Canadian, or I set myself in Taiwan, and then I would think that what fits me already changed a lot in YouTube or in Google. So and this remind me of how do you think that we can seduce, when you talk about the production, is actually rooted in university, and I would like to ask how you think that we could find the power to produce, like the power if it's lies not in the producer, but begin with the reader, because now we are now a more passive reader. because of the algorithm and because of the geolocalization that you mentioned. So this is something I'm curious.
I do think you're right in your question. At the same time, I mean, look at and probably because of your age, you cannot compare as I do. But when I was your age, I mean, we were much more passive than you are, because at that time it was like the movie was in theater, the music was on the radio, and we never interact with anyone except maybe with our friend in high school or in the university. But I mean, the way you can interact now, I mean, for us to produce a movie was just not possible at all. Writing an article was not possible. I mean, you need to go to the big newspaper. I don't know, here it's let's say the South China Morning Post to write an article, and they will say, oh, you're too young, come back in 10 years, and so on. So it was not possible to produce anything until you had the diploma, the experience, you began as an intern, and so on and so forth. Today, I mean, all the kids I know they already produce films, they do podcasts, they are photographers, and so on and so forth. They write articles on blogs and online newspaper. The number of outlets, the news and content, place where the content can be done is amazing. So probably you might say that you might be right, it's not enough and we are still very passive and so on. It's good also to be passive sometimes. I mean, on that, I don't agree with Jean-Luc Godard to say, you know, movie is not just, or book is not just something complicated where you are bored and you're not happy because you need to see art and art should be pain. You know, no, sometimes it can be entertainment. Can be just, you can be passive and watch something and not necessarily think too much. It can be good also to be very passive, but it's good sometimes to be active and to be also a producer yourself. So it's a mix of things. And I do think the internet gives us that opportunities. And that's why I think, you know, a lot of bad things come from the internet. We know that. A lot of fake news, a lot of police control, a lot of harassment, and so on and so forth. But I'm among the people who still believe that the internet is, the better part of it is more important than the worst. I might be wrong. Maybe we will all be Trumpinized, or I don't know how you say that, with Donald Trump becoming our mainstreamization of Trump. But I do think we live in a much more interested, innovative, and actually open world than before.
Okay, back to the floor. So the students is the class of culture and technology, right? So any questions that you have relating to that regard?
I want to know what that is. Question. What's that question then?
What is my question?
Yeah, what is that question?
So thank you for your question. Your question was about, do you believe in Hong Kongese identity?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Something
Thank you.
like that.
That question was good. You know, I don't want to do any politics here, and even though I thank Alan to be with us today, you know, I came in Hong Kong many times. I mean, for me, it's far away, probably 6 times. And I've been here in many moments where the city was in, let's say, in big debate. And the reason why, first of all, I love Hong Kong. I love the food. I love the place. I love Central. I love Admiralty. I love the M+ that I visited several times this weekend and today, especially, by the way, I love the exhibition of Marcel Duchamp. It's a very little one, but if you have the time, I recommend that. I love the Duchamp and the Warhol. I love, what is her name? Kusama, the Japanese artist. She's wonderful. And the collection shows, the permanent collection shows that you have still freedom of expression, freedom of artist, and piece of art that are incredible. I also love the Tycoon in Central. The LGBT exhibition is closed since yesterday, I think, but it was really, really good. And I had the opportunity to visit with the curator, and he explained me everything. By the way, that's part of the answer on the identity. You know, that's the very little issue, a specific issue on LGBT rights. But, you know, the exhibition told me something that I didn't know. The exhibition at Tycoon was showing the history of LGBT references in the very old time in China, in Hong Kong, also in India and in Asia in general. You see gods in India that were protecting the LGBT people, and also painters that were using LGBT codes in the 19th century or even before. And so a lot of people sometimes in some dictatorship in Africa or even in India, on some other country in the world, were saying, you know, we are African, we are Asian, and LGBT issue is not our issue because it has been imported by the colonialism, the colonial people, and they kind of bring with them homosexuality and LGBT rights. And we don't like that because it's Western. When you see this kind of exhibition, you see it is not Western. And actually, if you don't know that, I give you the tips. It is the opposite. When I was in Africa or in India, people were saying, you know, we don't like LGBT rights because it's French or British. It is not. The French and especially the British arrive in Africa and they put in the law homophobia act. They were against LGBT rights. And all that basically for the British arrived by the UK to India. In India, they create a new civil code, you probably know that, with an article number 377. And this article was basically made in India to be against any homosexual activities. And that code was replicated everywhere in the Commonwealth. And here, for example, in Hong Kong, it was also the article number 377. It was the same in many African countries. So when you listen that people saying, we want to protect us from LGBT rights because it's Western, that's the opposite. It was local, and the colonial actually tried to avoid LGBT things by the code. So that's just a bracket. I close the brackets. But to go back on your question on the Hong Kong identity, I think that's part of the answer. Hong Kong, it's a long story. It has a British history, and you cannot cancel that, even though some people want to, some historians want to, you know, never been British. That's of course not the case. But it was much more than that. It was also in the past with an history, with a language, with even I met somebody that explained me, and you know probably that better than me, something that is called Kongish. It's a kind of a local, I mean, you know that probably, it's a kind of local mix of English and Cantonese, but in a new way, which means if you speak only English like me, you're not going to understand. And if you speak only Cantonese, you don't either understand. It's a mix of things that is kind of making fun sometimes of things. I don't know if it's a small language kind of slang, a kind of slang, or if it will become a way of creating an identity. You know, again, I don't want to do politics here, but I do think that people here are different. They have a different background. they have a different language, they have a different history. And all that make them unique. They make them singular. In a way or in another, it will stay. That was my answer to your question.
Thank you, Frédéric.
I do echo that answer, your last answer, Professor. I'm not going to do any politics here. So, Dr. Choi, I don't want to get you into trouble or the Hang Seng University into trouble. So I'm not doing any politics here. But I'm quite confident that this Hong Konger identity will stay. And not only stay, but it will actually prosper. But I'll stop at that. I have one question, as this gentleman behind me just asked about AI. Professor, you talked about the internet not having borders, but internet does have frontiers. And one of your arguments is that because we do not speak the same language, so such frontiers must continue to exist. But we are now all mad about this ChatGPT. I was talking to a lady who does simultaneous interpretation, SI, and she was telling me that before too long, all these SIs will be out of job because the ChatGPT will do a much, much better job and more accurate, faster, and instantaneously. Now, do you think that, I just zoom in on the translation part of it. If ChatGPT can do such a good job, although I don't speak French, I can talk to you, share my ideas with you, write to you in French through ChatGPT instantaneously. Does that change your theory about frontiers in the internet?
It works now. You're absolutely right, and I think it's you made a good point. However, when I was speaking about frontier, I mentioned the language, but it's not, the frontier is not based just on language. It's based on many things. I also mentioned the territory where we live. I mentioned the sphere of culture we are in. And I think there is many elements that explain why take your sons or daughter, I don't know if you have daughters and sons, but if they are in high school, if you have brothers and sisters in high school, you will see who they speak. They are not speaking with another kid in Japan. They don't, or maybe it can happen because it happens to have somebody from the family that lives in Japan and so on. But as a general thing, they mainly stay with the friends from their school. They mainly speak. And even me, if I look at, it's very funny, but when I look at my, my book has been translated in many countries. And also I gave conferences all around the world. I speak with tons of people. And then one day I look at my Twitter account and I see it's possible to do that with some tools. You know, where are the people that are following you? And I was very surprised that even though I put my Twitter code in every book translated all around the world, my base is still really mainly in France, even though there is a bit of people everywhere in the world. But like I would say 80% of the people following me, among, I don't know, 50,000 or something, it is, they are in France and mainly in Paris, actually. So it might be not a good example, but I do think that we are not global people. We still live somewhere. We can move. it can change with us. I don't say, let's say, for example, if I am a lesbian and a veggie lesbian, I might be interested to speak with other veggie lesbian everywhere in the world, but still is a frontier, because then the non-veggie lesbian will not going to be in this discussion. So among the elements that make the frontier, there is the language, there is the place where I live, there is my culture, there is my community. And that community, it doesn't mean necessarily that it's a local place, but it means there is still a frontier between my community and the other community. Even though, and I finish with that, there is this big debate, I mean, it was a few years ago, about the so-called internet bubbles. And we were, because of internet, living in a bubble. This is not what I'm saying exactly, because the bubble is something else. The bubble will mean, because of what you are thinking or listening, you just have people thinking and listening the same thing than you. Actually, if it would be the case, we would not have fight. And we have fight all the time. So on Twitter, on Facebook, and so on. If we have fight, it means that people go out of their bubble. So I do think the frontier things is more interesting than the bubble. And I go back on that, on what I said in the beginning. We are all the product of multiple identities. You know, I might be not Hong Kongese. I might be not the same age than you, girl, but we might have some things in common in other way. Because in the different element of my identity, there is things that are making us different, but there is also things that make us the same. Maybe a political ID, maybe a culture things, maybe something else. And on that issue, I recommend a book that is very good by Amartya Sen about the multiple identities. And I think that's also what's happening on the internet. You can have one of your identity in a place and another one on the other one, and creating debate with people, even though sometimes there is a big fight. To summarize and to finish on that, you know, for example, people in Israel and in Palestine might not speak because they are not friends. And one is, let's say, Jewish, and the other one is Sunni or Shia. And they cannot speak because they are in war. Maybe both of them are lesbian. And maybe they can speak because they are both lesbian. Or maybe they can speak as women, or as mother that lost a kid, or because they, I don't know, they love K-pop. So you might not speak with somebody else because you are in fight, but thanks, we have different identities, and you can create the debate on another identity, and then it creates a possibility of a speech, a discussion, or an exchange when it was not possible on the other kind of identity. And that's why I'm so against all this kind of radical movement, like some Islamic radical thinkers or whatever, because they believe you are just something. You are just Muslim. You are just, let's say, they only look at one of your identity. I'm just French, but maybe being French, I don't like the British, because we had a lot of fight in the history. But we are much more than just French. Again, I'm French, but I'm also from the south of France. I'm also a man, or a lesbian, or a woman, or whatever, and so on. And it creates the possibility of discussion. Thank you, maybe.
Okay, so here comes to the end of today. And once again, let's join me to give a warm thank you to Professor Frédéric Martel.
Merci. And if you go back to this website, you have all the books, the reference, and also the article I published that are much more developed than what I said today. Thank you, Samuel, for your invitation also.
Thank you.